Welcome, everyone, back to the main stage. I am so thrilled that we're kicking off the last day of No War 2021 with a live performance by Amaikuda et les Bois. Whether on the street, the stage, or in the studio, for Amaikuda et les Bois, music is about healing, the healing of the earth, our ancestors, and ourselves. Their genre-defying music has won tons of awards, including being named Standout Artist, Best Folk Roots Award from the nationwide CBC Searchlight competition, Best Song at the Toronto Independent Music Awards. I can attest that they're equally likely to be performing at renowned venues and festivals across Turtle Island as on the streets at a demo or protest. And they've just released an amazing new album called Emergency. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Amai and Kuda.
Hi, well, thank you for having us. We're honored to be part of this really important work that you're doing. And we always pouring libation and an address to ancestors. And we'd like to acknowledge that we're on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe stolen territory and that we stand in solidarity with their struggles for land rights and justice. Ashiyo.
Ibase misavumaye aramise fikamboye ibayo fie batembise fiambu aramisa fikaya aramisa vumatle fumaku aramise vumambiye ku
Ashi. The first song we're going to do today is called Better Day, and it is about, it was actually inspired or written in the during the uprising last year in the wake of the George Floyd murder, and it speaks specifically to our struggle as Black people fighting to achieve justice, but it also speaks to everybody in the world, I think, who is fighting for a better world, and that includes, I think, everybody at this conference. Fighting the good fight, as it were, whether it's through organizing, music, or all the other means that we put our energies into creating change. So bear with me and drink some water. And I'm joined by Kuda Kwashe, my son, who's part of the band.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's been too long. We're shedding these tears for the ones we love and all the stolen years. And then they let go. All our hopes and prayers until we pick up stones to protect the ones we love. Oh, 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 I know, said I know, but we will fight and pray to build a better day. No, we know the way to build a better day, better day, better day, better day. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. 10 million marches, more than 10,000 songs. Still we carry on, always getting stronger. Pick up our sword and shield and our healing bombs. Yeah, we must take up our house to protect the ones we love. Oh, 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 I know, said I know, we will fight and pray to build a better day.
Build a better day. Ashe. So that song is called Better Day, like I said, and it is on our album, which has been released, but it's only been released in vinyl. You can buy it at local stores or across the country, actually, or on our website. You can buy the real hard copy vinyl. That's all that's available. That one is not available online because we were doing a gradual rollout, and we wanted to give a chance for people to just experience music in that old-fashioned way and to connect to the album itself. You know, this used to be an experience we had where we would sit down and just engage with the whole thing. So feel free to ask us questions about that after. And the next song is called Escuche, which is for the healing of the waters. And that is available online because we're rolling out sharing songs gradually. So you can find it on Spotify and all those other streaming platforms. But please join with us in sending energy to the waters that we all rely on for life, and the waters that are part of ourselves. I think that's a very important part of our own healing.
Itaboyevu tinisabake mbutiba tinisafutema Itaboyevuma tembisa kore idada yevumayo tembisa kure fitambo ibabaye fikare misavure tamisahureka tamisahure mie idada yavure mio kambisavure mbie ida fukora fitamisabore si baba yakureko andawore misababa fiewo andawore misababa fiewo tawaroromie dawore misababa fiewo dawore misababa fiewo tawaroromie ifungabatu ifumbateko idabo itamisefumangabatu isambore komisafiawa etafure mambo etafure mitsafutreba itafukore itafure misaba ewore misako ewore misefikiwo simpaba yawore ipafikewore idefure mambo simbisa kore lamatefiteba dawore misababa fiewo dawore misababa fiewo tawaroromie dawore misababa fiewo dawore misababa fiewo tawaroromie escuche
Kuchero, kuche, 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 kuchero, kuche, 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 kuchero. Ashe. Thank you for joining us and for us allowing us to join you. And I'm very, very thankful to have this opportunity to be part of the important work that's being done. Make sure this is stopped, so just check this. Yeah, so thanks again for having us. And yeah, we lend our energies to all of yours in fighting for a better world and a world that does not involve people having bombs dropped on them. And yeah, allows people to enjoy their right to live in peace. So thank you, everybody, for all the work that you're doing, and thank you for having me. Having us, I should say, sorry.
Thank you so much, Amai and Kuda. That was so powerful and just such an amazing way to start off our final day of the conference. Oh, sorry, you were muted just to avoid the echo. If you wanted to say something else, I'll let you unmute yourself. I'm so sorry, you're muted right now, Amaya and Kuda. Please unmute yourself if you'd like to just say goodbye or so forth before we move on to our panel.
Oh, sorry, yes, goodbyes, and please stay in touch with us. We're on all the social media and everything. I love to connect with people through that. So connect with us. Thanks again.
Wonderful, and we will send out information about your new album and your website to everyone who's here. And I see people are asking in the stage chat about it. So thank you so much. Now I'm really thrilled to be bringing up Geneviève Nevin to moderate our next panel. Geneviève is a community organizer studying law at McGill University. She's passionate about politics and social justice and is actively involved in movements for migrant rights and Palestine solidarity, particularly within the Jewish community. Welcome, Geneviève.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for that introduction. I'm really excited to begin moderating our panel, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. Before I begin, I want to first acknowledge that I'm moderating this panel as a settler from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples in what is colonially referred to as Victoria. And so today, as we speak about militarism and resistance to militarism that's being perpetuated by colonial governments around the world, it is also incumbent on all of us to stand with Indigenous peoples everywhere who are resisting militarism and the violence that takes place across their homes here in Turtle Island and elsewhere. So I'm going to introduce our panel a little bit today. We're going to be hearing from we're really lucky to hear from the panelists we have who are going to talk about concrete actions to non-violently resist weapons and war. We're going to discuss who is most vulnerable because of being trapped in war zones or targeted by military and police attacks, and also who benefits from international weapons peddling and the international arms trade. So together, we'll also discuss how we can dismantle the shadowy and secretive acquisitions of weapons beyond any international control. And to do that, we will be hearing from our guests, Kelsey Gallagher, Bruce Moncourt, and Kathy Kelly. And our first speaker today, we have Kelsey Gallagher, who is a researcher with Project Plowshares, which analyzes the Canadian military exports and the broader Canadian arms trade. So Kelsey is also the manager of Project Plowshares database on the Canadian military production and exports, which is the most comprehensive of its kind. He has an MA in Peace and Conflict Studies from Conrad Grelber University College at the University of Waterloo, and also a BA in Political Science from Western University. So after Kelsey, we will be hearing from Bruce Moncourt, who has served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 10 years, where he was injured in Operation Medusa, having been shot in an American friendly fire incident. He then spent another 10 years advocating for his rightful pension and the pension of his peers. And after being released from the military, Bruce met his partner, Nikki Ashton, where they have twin boys. And lastly, we will also hear from Kathy Kelly, who has co-founded and helped coordinate Voices of the Wilderness and Voices for Creative Nonviolence. Kathy has lived in active combat zones in Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Haiti, Lebanon, and Gaza. And Kathy and her companions organized 70 delegations to defy economic sanctions against Iraq, and she has lived in Baghdad throughout the 2003 shock and awe bombing. During each of these 30 trips to Afghanistan, Kathy learned from and helped support Afghan peace volunteer projects. And for crossing lines of the US military bases, she was sentenced to US federal prison 3 times. The longest sentence was for 1 year after planting corn on nuclear missile silo sites at White Man AFB. And as a war tax refuser, she has refused payment of all forms of federal income tax since 1980. So without further ado, we will welcome our first speaker, Kelsey Gallagher. So welcome, Kelsey.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. But first of all, I just want to say thanks so much for inviting us to this excellent event. Very cool seeing how many people are attending and that we have an international audience. I think we're all lucky to be sharing this space together. So my name is Kelsey Gallagher. I'm a researcher with Project Plowshares. Project Plowshares is one of Canada's oldest peace research organizations. We're based out of Waterloo, Ontario. And we look at issues of peace and disarmament through a policy lens, generally speaking. We have different portfolios on nuclear disarmament, on emerging tech, on space security, as well as tracking the arms trade, in particular the Canadian arms trade, and that's where I step in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the Canadian arms trade, you would usually call military exports, and then I'm going to go and actually touch on 4 or 5 particular locations that Canada exported weapons to in 2020 that are of particular concern due to human rights abuses of international humanitarian law during conflict, as well as reflecting against Canada's obligations domestically and under the Arms Trade Treaty not to export weapons to those who are likely to misuse them. So very generally speaking, Canada is usually seen around the world as a kind of an arbiter of peace and justice. Again, certainly not by everyone, but by many people. If you find yourself in a cafe in Europe or somewhere, that's really what people will tell you they know about Canada. However, Canada has been for decades and remains a major exporter of weapons. These export destinations include quite literally some of the worst regimes on the face of the planet. The SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, usually puts Canada, their most recent data, they put Canada at about 17th in the world for arms exports. We would actually argue that Canada is probably higher up than that. And one of the reasons why this is some monitors, and they do excellent work, but some monitors actually frequently undervalue the price of certain Canadian military exports. In particular, light armored vehicles manufactured in southwestern Ontario in a place called London, that is one of Canada's biggest pieces of equipment that we export abroad that I will touch on. So all things considered, we're actually probably higher than 17. And as Canada is not a huge country, I mean, population, we're some 40th or something in the world, we're certainly outpacing the size of Canada in terms of how many weapons we sell abroad. The Canadian arms trade also, and this is important to note, is very export reliant. The Canadian Armed Forces is not a huge force, really. And so whereas many countries, their domestic arms manufacturing base will usually sell to the national government, which is what happens in Canada too. For the Canadian arms trade to grow and stay viable as a market, we have to send our weapons abroad in order to grow and continue. At least this is kind of the thinking from arms manufacturers. And the Canadian government plays a major role in this as well. The Canadian government frequently actually brokers Canadian weapons abroad. our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada, as we call it, will frequently go and actually broker these deals on behalf of Canadian arms manufacturers, including some of the worst and highest ticket arms deals in recent years. So currently, you know, and thinking about how Canada is perceived around the world, currently we have a Liberal government, at least by name, that's promised many things. You know, increase in peacekeeping. Canada is, you know, where peacekeeping was thought up. You know, a greater value of money going into international development, that sort of thing. But under our current government, Canada has exported more weapon systems to states accused of war crimes than any prior Canadian government on public history, or on public record rather. So things have really slid into a pretty horrible place. And we see the Canadian arms trade continue to rake in billions of dollars annually. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. So recently, the federal government released data on Canada's military exports in 2020, and there's 4 locations that I've picked out for their kind of serial disrespect for human rights, as well as how much, in terms of value, Canada has exported in military goods to these countries, and in particular what we've exported. So the first country that I wanted to touch on would be Israel. Canadian military exports to Israel have trended up in recent years. Last year, it was almost $20 million worth of exports to Israel. And in the past 10 years, collectively, Canada has exported almost $100 million in military exports to Israel. I should note, too, that the data that I'm drawing from is only prime contracts. This is not subcontracts or secondary transfers, because the Canadian government only actually reports on military goods that go directly from Canadian soil to a foreign place. So there's actually a huge part of the Canadian arms trade that is not only not reported, but it's actually not controlled by the federal government. So that is all to say, the export values to these destinations are actually also probably much higher than they appear on the public record. So in recent years, Canada has exported relatively, compared to the other goods exported to Israel, our 2 biggest export categories are electronics, and we really don't fully understand what's in that category, as well as aerospace goods, and perhaps most disturbingly, bombs. We know that Canada's exported, for instance, in the last year, about $4 million worth of bombs, and that is particularly troubling because we know that the Israeli Air Force consistently is alleged to breach international humanitarian law, also known as the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, while bombing Gaza. And we recently, of course, just saw that Israel consistently bombing civilian sites, which is a breach of international law, bombing things like apartment buildings that have media offices, no clear legitimate target. And by virtue of that, Canada, arguably under the Arms Trade Treaty and under domestic law, cannot export to Israel those goods that are likely to be used in these breaches. So moving on, our third location I'm going to touch on is the United Arab Emirates. So the UAE is a monarchy. The UAE does not have a functioning democracy to speak of. The UAE is also, and this might be putting it lightly, a junior partner to the war in Yemen, if only compared to Saudi Arabia. The UAE has been fighting in Yemen since 2015, since the beginning of that war, and routinely is alleged to again breach international humanitarian law in that conflict through airstrikes, through artillery strikes, and so forth. Last year, Canada exported about $25 million worth of military goods to the UAE, and collectively over the past 5 years, that value is in excess of $100 million. Right. So some things we do know that Canada has exported to the UAE through subcontracts include several Bombardier jets. A couple of years ago, 2 Bombardier jets were exported, were transferred via, I believe it was Sweden, thereafterwards to the UAE in excess of $100 million. So these are huge values of transfers. And these Bombardier jets are then, they're actually exported to Saab, who outfits them with a bunch of spy hardware so they can spy and see what's going on the ground, and then supplies them to the UAE. Canada has also exported trainers from a company based in Quebec called CAE, one of Canada's biggest arms manufacturers, to train the UAE, to train fighter pilots. And again, there's a very real risk that these fighter pilots are then going to use that training to go and bomb targets in Yemen and potentially kill civilians, right? On top of that, Canada has exported dozens of Quebec-made aircraft engines made by a company called Pratt & Whitney Canada. We've also exported dozens of units of surveillance and targeting sensors from a company in Burlington, Ontario called Westcam. These surveillance and targeting sensors are used to guide smart munitions towards targets. And again, because we know that the UAE consistently kills civilians with things like airstrikes, Canada not only shouldn't, but cannot export these weapons to that recipient. I'm going to motor on. I see I've already been speaking for at least about 10 minutes, so I'm going to keep this quick. The next two countries I want to touch on are Turkey and Saudi Arabia. So the last few years, Turkey has been a major destination of Canadian weapons, and most of these have actually primarily been the weapon variant I was just speaking about, surveillance and targeting sensors made by a company called Westcam. These sensors are primarily used on the Turkish, now infamous, the Bayraktar TB2 drone, which Turkey has used in a series of conflict zones, including Libya, Iraq, Syria, in the southeast of Turkey against the PKK, and also recently exported them to Azerbaijan in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. The past 5 years, Canada has exported in excess of nearly $400 million worth of these sensors, or worth of weapons, to Turkey, and the last few years over $200 million worth of these sensors. This situation in particular is actually a good one to touch on for the purpose of this panel. We saw Canadian weapons exports to Turkey actually halved this year, and a large reason for that was a lot of organizing and reporting from the Canadian peace community actually on this company, Westcam, and how Canada was supplying sensors to Turkey, who was then using them in situations that breach international humanitarian law, as well as illicitly providing them to their allies in a series of conflicts. This actually led, in no small part, to Canada suspending and recently actually canceling the export of these sensors to Turkey. So this is a scenario which I think the peace community can really celebrate. I mean, we had concrete change to Canadian policy because we did our homework and showed that these weapons should not have been transferred to Turkey, and we were successful. The last country I want to touch on, again, I really don't want to go over time, is Saudi Arabia. Anyone from Canada in this panel has probably read about Canadian military exports to Saudi Arabia. And if you haven't, you might actually be at the wrong event, because this is something that we talk about consistently. Aside from the US, Saudi Arabia is far and away Canada's prime destination for military exports. Canada has exported weapon systems to Saudi Arabia for decades, and most of these weapon systems are light armored vehicles, as I touched upon. We say LAVs or LAVs, and these are produced in a place called London, Ontario, by a subsidiary of General Dynamics called General Dynamics Land Systems Canada. The major deal here was a deal that was signed in 2014 for approximately $15 billion worth of these weapon systems to Saudi Arabia. This was a deal that was actually facilitated and actively brokered by the Canadian government. The Canadian Commercial Corporation is that arm of the government, what we call the CCC. And we've seen these LAVs exported from about 2017 on. So in the last 5 years, Canada has exported $6.25 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. The lion's share of these weapons are LAVs. And in the last year, we exported about 1.3, or in 2020 rather, $1.3 billion worth of these LAVs to Saudi Arabia. When you put these exports to the other export destinations for Canada, the values are comically large. They would be comically large if it wasn't so horrifying that Canadian weapons are going to not only one of the worst human rights abusers in the world, Saudi Arabia, but we also know that they're being used in the war in Yemen. a conflict that invariably is described as today's worst humanitarian catastrophe. And as stated, we actually know that these LAVs are being used in operations by Saudi Arabia in that conflict. So once again, I don't want to monopolize the mic, but that's kind of a snapshot on where Canadian exports are being sent, reflecting on how Canada, in reflection of how Canada is seen abroad and how we see ourselves, right? If Canada wants to believe that it is an arbiter of peace and justice, then we cannot continue to arm these war criminals. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. And of course, we'll get a chance to hear from you again when we move on to the question and answer portion of the talk. So I'm excited now to introduce again Bruce Moncourt to the stage. So thank you, Bruce.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for bringing me on and asking me to be part of this incredible event. I too would like to acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 5 territory in northern Manitoba. I wanted to say, I'm as a veteran and as somebody that has seen both sides of the spectrum here, I am, very aware of the fact that it's kind of, I'm kind of I've seen kind of behind the curtain in a sense of how the Canadian military operates and in a degree, some of its allies. I wanted to start by saying that there is a scene in the movie, in a Marvel movie called Iron Man. And it starts with Tony Stark giving a presentation of the new weapon system. And then the scene ends with him being injured by a missile strike. And before the bomb detonates, he sees his last name etched on it. And of all the war scenes in the movies over the years that I've seen, that is one of the most realistic I've come across. I'd always wondered who was arming the other side. If I could see a Canadian maple leaf on the side of a vehicle, or worse still, a missile landing at my feet, and instead of the name Stark, seeing a Made in Canada sticker. Selling arms indiscriminately to countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, and a host of other nations exercising violations of human rights, as we heard in the last presentation, has always been considered the fog of war. But what happens when you have to fight a former customer? If they eventually become a country that we take up arms against and has decades of arms bloating their armories to the point that will only be correlated to a flag-draped coffin returning home, the irony of which the gun that spelt their demise would be built in their hometown. The more they desire to keep the public ignorant of the billions of dollars worth of trade that flows through our country to theirs, that these instrumented deaths go in the hands of oppressive peoples who in turn make collateral damage out of defenseless women and children. It is through our failures that we have seen that our hands are soaked red with blood. Our failures have manifested the extermination of thousands. Make no mistake about it. Since the end of the Second World War, the American industrial war complex is responsible for over 20 million deaths, while for the most part, Canada has been a more than willing accomplice. North of the border, our manufacturing capabilities are all but wiped out. Free trade deals have eviscerated our ability to make anything. After NAFTA, the laws that have been created to protect the factories have been reversed, and companies began to find cheaper methods to build their products in countries like Mexico, China, and India. It is through these countries that we saw an exodus of our manufacturing. The only constant in Canadian manufacturing has been the arms trade, so much so that so-called progressive political entities have rallied around these death factories in the name of jobs. While there are entities that do fight back, like Labor Against Arms Trade, for the most part, the progressive establishments has long since tied their support to selling instruments of death. We are seeing a Canadian government that is treating its military like it's expendable. While it allows billions in munitions to be exported, they refuse to spend any money for the Canadian military. The three-headed dragon, as I call it. We have equipment that is over 50 years or 40 years old, and they're getting parts out of museums. Military sexual assault is running rampant. The Liberal Defense Minister, Harjit Sajjan, knew for 3 years that his chief of defense staff had allegations of sexual misconduct against him and still renewed his contract. When the allegations came to light, he proceeded to blatantly lie to the Canadian people about knowledge of it. Now, there are 5 generals embroiled in MTS scandals. And finally, a failure to take care of those who get injured physically and mentally, myself included. I was shot 3 times. I had 5% of my brain removed, and I was given a lump sum pension for the rest of my life of $22,000. Thanks for coming out. More Canadians have committed suicide than died in Afghanistan. It is the triple D policy, as we call it here. Delay, deny, die. They tell you no enough times, you will go away. And you go away, and eventually you die. So the problem to them is solved. The numbers in the Canadian forces have never been lower. 42,000 total reserve and regular force. The state of the Canadian military is in complete disarray. And yet we are selling arms across the world. It is truly a tale of two policies. I believe that the Canadian government allows arms dealers to bolster and expand indiscriminately around the world to whomever provides the money. They also in turn refuse to acknowledge the state of the military within. The ironies of ironies would see a military defeated by the very weapons it sold. Shakespearean and prophetic, and yet greed only blinds the path to justice. We find ourselves disillusioned by the continued morality, the continued morally corrupt politicians whose proverbial rock bottom will be all of our undoings, truly reaping what we sow, to be taken out by the very bombs we built. And this time there is no fictitious superhero emerging from the ashes to appeal to our humanity. History is destined to repeat itself. Decisions made by politicians see the poor class, in particular, young men and women aged 18 to 25. Not to mention the millions of innocents killed around the world. While you, the people in this meeting, are demonized for being unpatriotic and naive, always remember that you were on the right side of history, and the morally corrupt that seem destined to destabilize the world in the pursuit of the almighty dollar. But I sit before you as a veteran that has experienced the battles of imperialism and know that the work you are doing is key to getting the truth out there. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it back over to Genevieve.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bruce. That was really powerful. Lastly, our speaker, before we move on to questions, and there's been a lot of really great questions, so feel free to continue posting them there or also in the Q&A tab. Our last speaker, before we move on to question and answer, is Kathy Kelly. So go ahead, Kathy.
Well, thank you, Jen, and thank you very much to Kelsey and to Bruce for very compelling statements about this enormous question we face. How can we ever begin to solve the very real terrors our whole planet faces if we don't dismantle our huge and utterly dangerous and wasteful military apparatus that is, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King once described it, functioning like a demonic suction tube. I think one of the givens that is very important to consider is that stories are a #1 way to make sense of our reality. But when the consequences of our ravaging wars are secretive and hidden, when we really have such a hard time, as our other speakers have demonstrated, even just trying to find out to what extent are the countries that we're responsible for creating havoc and bloodshed and murder. If we don't know the stories, it's kind of difficult to compel people, to persuade people with statistics alone. And I see that as very linked to the reality of drone warfare today. You know, if all that is seen on the drone operator's screen are blobs that are actually cars or vehicles in a convoy, or dots that are actually people, And because they're so very, very far away, it makes it a lot easier to go to war and to kill. And a case in point for me that I found so stirring was the film National Bird, which appeared some years ago. And it was a documentary about people who became whistleblowers and said, we just can't do this anymore in terms of drone warfare. And one of the materials released by the whistleblowers showed an incident of a real life scene in a remote area of Afghanistan, wherein U.S. paratroopers had landed on a mountainside to do an operation, and a convoy was coming along the mountainside. And so there was a sort of panicked sense, who is in that convoy? Might that convoy attack the U.S. forces? And so there begins a very heated conversation wherein some of the drone operators and then the eventual kill chain team are saying, yeah, we're sure that those must be weapons. This must be nefarious. You can't trust these people. But it's all based on presumption. At one point, the evidence that they felt sure showed that each passenger within the convoys was carrying a weapon, turned out later to be passengers carrying turkeys that women and children in the convoy and men were carrying to bring to their relatives who lived in Kabul. So this was clearly a civilian convoy afterward, after the real material facts were revealed. But we see in this very dramatic footage that was released, the conversation in which, to some of the drone operators, the question is not who might be hit, but what a sweet target. Look at how easily we can land them. And then we see the bombs explode against the first car and then hit the third car in the convoy, and learn about the terrible loss of life. 21 people were killed. Well, meanwhile, in the United States and in Canada, the war profiteers, and I think particularly of the main big companies in the United States, for instance, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Boeing, they're confident in the United States. They're very confident that no matter who's in the White House, it didn't really matter, said the CEO of Boeing, Mr. David C. Calhoun, whether you have Republicans or Democrats, because any United States administration is going to want to defend democracy. And so we keep being bamboozled by the notion that all of this high-tech and grotesque weaponry, all of the money spent on these weapons and the weapons trade is going to defend us and defend a somehow superior way of life. And then when you start to ask more of the details, I mean, if we look at this latest attack and assault, which has been mentioned already, against Gaza. Well, I mean, I live in Chicago, and I should also say an area that was stolen from the Potawatomi Indians. Boeing is right on the shores of the Chicago River. And, you know, the executive, David Calhoun, has said that Boeing shareholders can be assured that the United States isn't going to want to jeopardize democracy. So Boeing produced Apache helicopters that were sold to Israel. They produced these Harpoon weapon systems that include laser-guided missiles sold to Israel. And in this last set of attacks, there were 67 Gazan children who were killed, and 2 Israeli children were killed. That was just during 11 days of fighting in May. How do the deaths of those children defend democracy in the United States? And so I think it's incumbent on us to keep on pressing these questions, and World Beyond War has done so well in doing that. Again, if we look further to the immediate circumstances in Yemen, in April and May alone, let me correct that, I'm sorry, in March and April alone, in one district, Sirwa, in the Marib province of Yemen, Saudi aircraft maintained by the United States with weapons sold by the United States with a great deal of guidance from the United States hit just this one district 10 times a day for every day of the months of March and April. And the month of May, I feel quite sure, hasn't been any better. Well, then, of course, the Ansar Allah, informally known as the Houthi, they have acquired drones, and possibly from Iran, and their drones were constructed through using 3D images. The proliferation of the weapons gets worse and worse, and also the Houthis are using weapons against people, civilians living in this Marib province as well. So today we learned that 17 civilians were killed by a Houthi bomb. But I would trace the majority of the killing back to the Western powers equipping the Saudis and the UAE with weapons from 2015 on into the present. And I think that we do see some momentum in being able to put an end to the United States' participation in the war against Yemeni civilians, and the way in which Canada has also been pulled into it. We have seen in the United States Congress twice bills that were proposed, and then Trump vetoed them, that said that there couldn't any longer be sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia. But very unfortunately, we haven't heard those essential 4 words: I am proposing a bill again to stop these terrible, terrible weapons sales. It should also be noted that many different companies contribute components to weapon systems these days. So you can't exactly assign a weapon to a particular manufacturer, but then this also makes it difficult to trace the weapon sales. General Atomics produces the MQ-9 drone, and it's a General Atomics product, but the Honeywell Corporation makes the engine. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Raytheon all make the bombs and missiles, and L3 Harris makes the training system and performs the depot maintenance. So there's quite a cabal and an interlinkage of these companies. But again, if I could refer to the Israeli assaults against Gaza most recently, in a way, we should not only just talk about the cost of war, but also the profits of war in terms of how advantageous it is for the weapon makers to tell the future clients, come on over, look at this footage with us, be part of this examination of that attack and this explosion, and see how well the targeted facility was destroyed. Well, that means that the weapon is battle proven, and it helps to actually sell more weapons, which is a pretty sinister situation for everybody involved, but certainly most horribly for people in this case who lived in Gaza. In the United States, we also have the revolving door problem. Our new Secretary of Defense, former General, retired General Lloyd Austin, formerly sat on the board of Raytheon Technologies. And this is just so common. People go from being powerful lobbyists with corporations to being elected officials or cabinet level appointees, and then go around and around in a circle. I think we should also note, though, the dangers of proliferation. I mentioned the drone proliferation happening in, for instance, the military structures of Ansar Allah. But this is not just with regard to drones. It's going to become increasingly plausible that non-state actors and countries waging asymmetric warfare can develop laser-guided missile systems. And the proliferation of cluster bombs was horrible. The proliferation of landmines has been horrible. And I think we can look toward some extremely lethal, chaotic, havoc-causing, grotesque weaponry being proliferated even further. So who is responsible? Well, certainly the secrecy is very, very dangerous. Consider, for example, that the country of Israel has never had to acknowledge that it possesses at least 45 thermonuclear weapons, quite possibly a good deal more. And so when Israel doesn't have to disclose what it possesses, this sort of green lights the possibility for other countries to say, well, if Israel didn't have to disclose, why don't we start acquiring the technology? And so we now see the Saudis moving in the process toward acquiring nuclear energy technology and not having to comply with any kind of International Atomic Energy Association investigations to see whether or not this might transform into weapon technology. Meanwhile, of course, the double standard is intense because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for Iran was torn up, and Iran has been under sanctions and siege and threat of warfare, even though they don't have even a teeny fraction of what the Israelis possess and have never even been required to declare, although the CIA can certainly detail what they possess. Regarding resistance, there's much to take heart in. It wasn't a shipment of weapons being resisted, but I think in terms of the participation in the boycott, divestment, sanctions action, which is trying to force the Israelis to stop the illegal occupation of Gaza and the Palestinian territories. The workers in Durban, South Africa said, sorry, we're not going to unload that cargo ship when it tried to land. Then just in the last couple of days, ships trying to land and dock and unload cargo in the Bay Area of San Francisco were turned back. And this is very encouraging. And we've also seen that with regard to arming the Saudi-led coalition that's fighting against Yemen in Italy, in Spain, and in France, there have been very strong dock actions taken to resist unloading or loading ships that would depart from these ports. We also see in the port of Baltimore in the United States, regular attention being paid to the monthly ships that are deployed on the body line to Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, in Canada, the brilliant efforts to literally stop the transport through train of weapon shipments is something to be very excited about and to pursue. It's said that Daniel Hale, a whistleblower, a drone whistleblower in the United States, is to drone warfare what Snowden was to the issue of surveillance. And he now is at risk of 10 years in prison. He was tried under the Espionage Act, which means that it's so top secret, it's very difficult for anyone to launch a defense on his behalf. And so he pled guilty because otherwise he could have faced 50 or 100 years in prison. So he's now awaiting sentencing, and he's in a very confining federal lockup in the United States where he's in solitary confinement most of the time. And Daniel Hale, I believe, was somebody who did something which we should understand because we should understand his motives and be inspired by them. But he is not allowed to say anything about motive, about why he did what he did. The same is true of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7 in the United States. Never were they allowed to say one word to a jury of their peers about their motivation. And of course, the media coverage is so skewed by these powerful lobbyists who manage to pay big bucks in order to sometimes keep the media in their pockets and in favor of defense spending. So we do face daunting difficulties in reaching the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government, as well as in reaching the court of public opinion. But, these daunting realities don't excuse us or absolve us of responsibility. And certainly the brave and clear actions that we see proliferate on behalf of peace call us into ever greater solidarity. So thank you for letting me chime in with the wonderful people on this panel so far.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you to all of our speakers today who shared such powerful speeches and testimony, and for the work that everyone is doing across this panel and across this conference on resisting militarism and war globally. So in this section of the panel, we can move to audience questions. We've already received quite a few in the chat, but feel free to also post there and also in the Q&A. I'm going to read out to all of the speakers. I know some questions were directed at a particular speaker, but call to all of the speakers at this panel, and I'll do it 3 at a time so our speakers can determine which part of the question or which question they wish to respond to. But my first 3 questions, the first one really spoke to the need of international courts or Canadian courts as a mechanism of enforcement against these weapon trades globally. So the question was, international courts and those who care about these sales being done besides human rights abuses, is there any way of enforcement? And can people go to the, can one go to the Supreme Court to stop this arms trade by the Canadian government or by foreign governments? So that's the first question. And it also ties into the second question asked, especially directed at Kelsey, but anyone who feels that they can answer can feel free to step in. But it was Canadian specific, asking if Canada is violating their own export laws for these arms exports, then could a legal case against the government be a strategy in putting a stop to this? And the follow-up question asked if there was someone already working on this. And then the last question, again, Canadian specific, but I think it's relevant to our speaker in the US as well. But if on the Canadian government website, it claims that they look at each export permit to Saudi Arabia individually, and that none of the LAVs sold in the last 2 years had ended up in Yemen, and how would you respond to this claim? So go ahead. I know Bruce and Kelsey, you're both muted now. So if you wanted to unmute yourselves and maybe kind of wave, and I'll point to you if you wanted to answer the first one. So go ahead, Bruce.
So I'll speak to the court thing. I know that the Supreme Court in 2019 in Canada refused to hear a court case about the arms deal to Saudi Arabia. And so it is an uphill battle for sure. The problem is we have a liberal and conservatives have basically formed government for the last 150 years, but in particular, the liberals have formed government for the last, I think, 91 of the last 100 years, or no, not 81 of the last 101 years. So they're actually the most successful democracy or a political party in a major democracy, and by being that so successful, they also have appointed all the judges and so it's very hard to overcome such odds when it's clearly stacked against you.
Thank you, Bruce. Kelsey, you're...
Yes. So yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Bruce said, and that's actually a pretty sobering statistic that I wasn't familiar with. Now, are these exports violating Canadian law? The answer is yes, and they're also violating international law, right? So Canadian military exports, the Canadian arms trade, is governed by the Export and Import Permits Act, which is domestic law. It's been in place for decades, I believe since actually the 1940s. And this is basically where Canada's domestic controls are spelled out. So Canada cannot, and to speak to the international sphere, as of September 2019, Canada has been a states party to the Arms Trade Treaty. So the Arms Trade Treaty is the first international framework to control the transfer of conventional weapons between states, right? And so under the Arms Trade Treaty, of which Canada is a states party, most of the world is actually a states party to the Arms Trade Treaty now. I think it's about 110 states. The US was a states party, but then Donald Trump unsigned the treaty, which has no basis in international law. We're not really sure what that means, but effectively the US is no longer a states party. But under the Arms Trade Treaty, it's very clear what states can and can't do. So as a states party to that framework, Canada cannot export weapons to a country that is going to violate international humanitarian law with those weapons, is going to violate international human rights law with those weapons, is going to use them to facilitate major instances of gender-based violence, and so forth. Canada can also not supply weapons to states that are going to divert them, which means the intended recipient takes those weapons and gives them to a third actor which could be an ally, which could be a terrorist group. And it's very clear and unambiguous what Canada can and can't do when it's transferring weapons. In the case of Saudi Arabia, again, unambiguously, this is a breach of the Arms Trade Treaty. We are arming a state that not only at home is one of the worst human rights abusers in the world, but we see what they're doing in Yemen, right? They're breaching international humanitarian law. They're arguably breaching international human rights law in their own country. They're diverting these weapons to their pals in that conflict. We've seen Canadian weapons, not just LAVs, but sniper rifles diverted in particular to the Yemeni government forces, which again, they've never been listed on an export permit. Canada wouldn't be able to export to them anyways. But the fact that Saudi Arabia is diverting these weapons to Yemeni forces is diversion and a breach of the Arms Trade Treaty. Now, what would I say to the government of Canada when they say that these weapons are not in Yemen? I say that's totally false. I mean, we literally have videos of these LAVs in Yemen. We literally have videos of Canadian-made LAVs that used to have Saudi markings, crudely replaced with coalition markings by Yemeni forces, right? We have huge amounts of data on this. And I should state that we don't need evidence that countries like Saudi Arabia are diverting weapons or breaching human rights. We just need to show that there is a risk that these countries are going to divert weapons, breach human rights, all of that. And that is the threshold at which Canada cannot export weapons. So we've already exceeded that threshold. So Canada, and we've heard this before, Saudi Arabia is not using Canadian weapons in Yemen. I mean, it's a total fabrication. It's a total fabrication. And the government of Canada has to carry that line because that is how they can continue to justify these weapons exports. Mm-hmm. And again, yeah, I mean, Bruce said it, right? There has been challenges in the Supreme Court. There's Mr. Daniel Turp, who is a former Bloc Québécois, a member of parliament. He's now a legal scholar based out of, I believe, Montreal. He's sued the government, I think, 3 times now. Now the last case, I can't remember where it was. I think they threw it out or something. But I mean, they really have no interest in engaging with these legal actions. And the reason why is because they want to continue exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia. So yeah, I mean, I guess in summary, these exports are a breach of a bunch of things. You just have to pick which one you want to focus on.
Great. Kathy, was there any questions you'd like to respond to?
Well, I'd just like to add that I think we do have a good example of international effort to create a ban, a weapons ban in the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because now that the United Nations actually passed it and then a 52nd country ratified it. For instance, if you were to go to Ireland and you were engaged in any kind of development, research, sale, transportation related to nuclear weapons, you could risk a huge fine or going to prison. Now, I don't recommend anybody going to prison, but I do like to see people rehabilitated. Anyway, I think this is a pointer toward what can happen. And I think we should also be working for a treaty, a similar treaty, to ban the proliferation of weaponized drones and police and military use of surveillance drones. And I would especially want to recommend the Ban Killer Drones organization, a new organization that has just recently started. But some people have worked so hard to get this treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons up and running. And now that it's got legs, and we've also seen the treaty to ban landmines and chemical weapons. Even if the United States thumbs its nose at these treaties, internationally, the United States is an outlier and should be treated as such, not imitated.
Thank you, everyone. So the next questions we have include a question asking how we can better videography or protest or other activism create better coverage of victims of all war. And this question also specifically highlighted how movements for Black Lives and also how movements for Palestinian liberation had such a good use of social media specifically to raise awareness of that struggle. So how can we all use technologies and protest effectively as a way to kind of raise awareness. And then the second question, which I'll also just add on to a little bit, but that question asks, the Canadian forces, and arguably also the US forces, also recruit in working class schools, promising career training and how that soldiers will be doing good overseas. So building schools in Afghanistan or peacemaking. So how can we counteract that line of messaging? And I just also want to add too, because I know not only just do Canadian forces recruit in schools, but we've also heard here in Montreal how the Israeli Defense Forces have been recruiting people at Canadian schools as well. And then the last question, which one of our speakers or all of our speakers could speak to, was a question wondering whether satellite images and surveillance products and other services are included in export statistics as services as opposed to goods. So to answer these questions, I'm going to ask Kathy to start, and then maybe we can move to Kelsey and Bruce. So go ahead, Kathy, if there's any that you'd like to respond to.
Well, thank you, Shannon. Thank you for all of those crucial questions. With regard to raising awareness, I mean, again, we have to deal with just how concerted the efforts of governments are to cover up the very awareness that we want to raise. There's an interesting anecdote about former President Trump in the United States getting his hands on a report that came out quadrennially, which actually has, throughout the horrible wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, detailed so many of the abuses and the violations and the atrocities. And that report, lands thump, thump, thump on the desks of every elected official. And very, very few of them really take the time or even assign a staffer to read them. Well, President Trump happened to read just a few pages of an account about things that happened in Afghanistan, and he blew his top. He said, put that in a cabinet and lock it up. Don't let anybody read that report. Think how damaging it will be to us. So I think we can't rely on governments to report on themselves. The whistleblowers face great threats, but at tremendous risk to themselves. People, for instance, in Yemen with the Yemen Data Project, or the Muatana for Human Rights, or Al-Karama, have reported on the consequences of drone attacks by the United States and by all the warring parties, but particularly I've been paying attention to the attacks by the United States. The United States has undercounted and underestimated in Iraq and in Afghanistan the numbers of people killed. And so it's on us to try to make disclosures about those terrible statistics. And likewise, just with regard to going into the schools and telling the students how wonderful it is that the humanitarian wars, and that's an oxymoron, are building in Afghanistan, schools and hospitals, we have to look at the actual facts about the ghost schools and the ghost hospitals and the war profiteers who pocketed all the money. They made the contracts, they fulfilled the contracts, and these places either didn't exist or they could never be used because they were so shoddily constructed. So the information is there, but it takes a tremendous amount of concerted effort together to disclose it.
I'd like to comment on the second question about the recruitment in the lower class and areas. I'm from Windsor, Ontario, which is it's south of Detroit. And during the height of the Afghan mission war, Windsor was the unemployment capital of Canada. So the Canadian government put an effort to recruit in this area and it was jobs. A lot of guys saw this as a way to work. And they upped their level of recruitment, and per capita, Windsor actually provided more soldiers to Afghanistan than anywhere else in Canada. Well, then shortly after the conflict finished, the liberal or the conservative government decided that they wanted to shut down the Veterans Affairs Office. So you have these people coming back broken physically and mentally, and the thanks that they got was the closure of their office. So frankly, as far as I'm concerned, is I don't understand why anyone would join the military, knowing what's happened to here to these soldiers. Well, I mean, they're not going to take care of you. I've seen the situation both in America and Canada, where it's not feasible. And I understand that desperate times call for desperate measures in terms of employment, but maybe it's time that we started looking at the role of the military. And in fact, here in Manitoba, where I'm living now, the military was instrumental in the COVID vaccinations in the First Nations, and they played a very big role in the vaccination rollout. And we're seeing now with climate change and global warming, we're seeing the fact that soldiers are now fighting forest fires and fighting floods and fighting ice, the damage in Quebec as example, the ice storms. So maybe we should look at perhaps the military's role being secondary, first and foremost, pandemic response and responses towards natural disasters, and then trying to phase out the combat role of the military.
And just Kelsey, go ahead, and just a little time check. We have about half an hour left for questions, and we do have quite a few lined up. So I'll let Kelsey speak and then move on to the next set of questions. So go ahead, Kelsey.
Yeah, so I can speak to a couple of those, and thanks to the chat for these interesting questions. So on the point of videography, I mean yeah, it's a very interesting question. We see, I mean, quite literally with the advent of camera phones, we see that conflict is better recorded than ever before. Previously, conflict was recorded in large part by Western journalists, and to be in the conflict zone many times, and speaking broadly here, but you had to have a military attaché. You had to be, vetted by the government wherever you were going. So the actual lens on specific conflicts were really hampered by a lot of outside forces. Basically, if someone didn't want you there, then you weren't going to be there. Now, though, we see a lot of times victims of conflict actually recording conflict itself, right? So this has led to some really great NGOs actually taking this data and giving us a better understanding of how conflict is affecting civilians around the world. So one organization in particular would be a great organization called airwars.org, based out of London, England. And they are deemed to be one of the best data collectors for civilian casualty events today. And a lot of their data is actually pictures and images and accounts that are posted on social media. And I mean, previously we just wouldn't have this level of detail looking into conflict. In terms of arms control, I mean, with the advent of camera phones and social media, we can literally track Canadian weapons, and other countries do the same thing with their arms exports, and see where they are popping up in conflicts where they're not supposed to be. And then when we have that information, we can bring it to governments, bring it to regulators, and say, look, we already thought this was the case, but we literally have a video of a rifle not where it's supposed to be. And we've seen this actually increasingly, the Canadian government sees this as legitimate data. And then just secondly, question on satellite surveillance goods. So yes, it basically, whether or not satellite and surveillance goods are seen as a military export or something along those lines. So it depends exactly what the good is and what it's being used for. Canada and many other countries do regulate satellite goods through what's called the Wassenaar Agreement. So yeah, if satellite goods are being exported abroad, they are actually seen as a military good, whether or not they're going to be weaponized. And surveillance goods certainly are. I mean, you can't fire a missile if you're blind, right? So Canada does export huge amounts of surveillance and targeting goods. A company I brought up earlier, L3 Harris Westcam, is actually one of the best in the world for high quality goods that can direct smart munitions. And when these do leave Canadian soil, they are exported as military goods, as they should be.
Everyone so much for those responses. So our second to last of questions. We have a really important one about that kind of highlights the link between militarism and climate catastrophe. So that is a question asking, isn't there an obvious contradiction between policies to increase arms manufacturing and those to decrease fossil fuel use? Who is raising this disjoint? And then the other two questions that are also kind of action-oriented is, how can we get citizens to vote for candidates without vested interest in these types of weapons companies? And how do we bring great to these issues with all of the barriers that the speakers have been talking about? So whoever of our panelists want to answer any of those questions, feel free to jump in. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you, Jens. I was so impressed during the most recent United States elections for Senate by a woman from Maine named Lisa Savage, and she's a former teacher, I think elementary school or maybe secondary school, a union organizer, and she has just assembled an extremely impressive anthology of materials related to the ways in which militarism contributes toward climate catastrophe, in spite of many, many cover-ups that the United States military would try to put forth. So I would strongly recommend Lisa Savage. She created an organization, an ongoing organization. In a way, she did win in her campaign because she won over so many people to her point of view. But her ongoing organization is called the Maine Natural Guard, Natural, not to be confused with the Maine National Guard. There has been some very, very compelling research of late that shows that the United States military is by far and above one of the worst polluters and contaminators. And even just when you think about the most expensive, the largest retrograde mission in military history involved the pull-out, withdrawal of United States troops from Afghanistan. But who is ever going to look at the ordnance that was showered hideously all across the country, or at what happens to the air when the United States bases burn all of their plastics in their burn pits, causing enormous contamination? And this at bases that are across the street from some of the most wretched refugee camps in Kabul, where people, because in the cold winter, can't survive unless they burn plastics for fuel.
Thank you, Kathy. Kelsey or Bruce, would you like to add anything to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can touch briefly just on transparency. I mean, and again, I know I come to this with a Canadian lens. We are a Canadian organization, so sorry if that's a bit niche. But I think one thing that people can do is to pressure government and make sure that they know that transparency is inherently good, right? Transparency is, again, inherently good. We need to have good publicly accessible data to understand how countries like Canada, how countries like the US, and other countries abroad are materially contributing to conflict, right? Again, under the Arms Trade Treaty, the preamble of that treaty reads that transparency is critical to actually to the overall obligations of the framework. So, I mean, we get data all the time that is completely redacted, or sometimes, I mean, the numbers just don't check out. Someone forgot to do their basic math, and this is not how governments should be supplying data. And unfortunately, it shows that they don't take these obligations seriously. In the Canadian sense, our biggest destination for weapons is the United States. However, the vast majority of data for U.S. arms exports to the United States is not and has never been reported. And that is unique only for the United States. And that is, once again, a breach of the obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty, which calls for a universal approach to regulating Canadian military exports. So I think one degree to, or one way you can push transparency, and perhaps it's a cliche answer, but, you know, call your local representative, harass these people. Like, they need to know that we need access to information to understand how you know, the Western world is fueling conflict abroad. And I think the other answer is to continue showing up to events like this, right? I mean, we need to normalize, we need to denormalize the idea that we can export billions of dollars of weapons abroad, and it's for security, or it's protecting people. And this is the narrative that many arms dealers actually say. Well, we're in the security business. This kind of delusional approach to understanding the world. So, I mean, you know, coming to events like this, supporting all of the great organizations that have been around this weekend, in order to denormalize the idea that it is normal whatsoever to materially contribute to conflict.
Great. Bruce, anything? Oh, go ahead, Kathy, and then.
Oh, excuse me, Bruce. I just want to add with regard to that Maine Natural Guard. They ask you to take a pledge, and it's a bit of an odd pledge, but you pledge that every time you are in a conversation or an exchange about climate catastrophe, you will mention the connection to militarism. And I think that's really important. And I also want to thank Kelsey for saying, come to events like this weekend's event, but also there are some pretty substantial courses being offered by World Beyond War. Any one of their courses, but several of them focus on this matter. So if anybody feels like, oh, I can't speak to that, I just don't know enough, but, you know, we can't too easily use that as an excuse these days. I'd certainly welcome people to join me in a course called Lay Down My Sword and Shield, which will cover some of these issues in July and August of this year. So thank you for that extra time.
Yeah, of course. Bruce, did you have anything to add before we move on to the next set?
I just wanted to say, you know, as somebody that's seen a bit of the behind the scene workings of the political spectrum here, I currently don't believe that there is any party here in Canada that is going to do the right thing. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this particular instance, especially with the trade deals. The arms trade deal that I think, we have our work cut out for us. So.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to move on to the last set of 3 questions. And the last question is something that can be addressed not only to our panelists, but to all of us who are in this conference today. And that has to do with what are some concrete steps that we can all get involved. So when that's going to be the last question, I think, that we can all close on. So when we move to that part of the session, maybe everyone who also has resources to share, events to share, also post those in the chat, and then we can connect with each other beyond this conference and beyond this event. But before we turn to the concrete action steps, I wanted to ask a question that was really tied into the questions we heard in the beginning, which is, why is it so hard to enforce war crime laws, not only kind of at the Supreme Court level in countries in the West, but also in international courts like the International Criminal Court, for example. So that's our first question. And then we will hear another question, which is, the US government approves sales of weapons to nations around the globe, but also gives free money to most militaries on earth, to which they use to buy weapons. And the question was, if Canada does this or aspires to do the same thing. And then lastly, and again, this is the opportunity for us all to kind of post links in the chat and to connect with each other. But the question was for each panelist to discuss what highest impact activity or what activities could participants do that would actually really concretely address the concerns that we've all presented at this conference. So as to the first few questions, is there anyone on our panel that would like to start that off? Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, thank you. You know, it troubles me a great deal, being from the United States, that when the International Criminal Court did indict the United States, and this was with regard to the United States blowing up a port city in Puerto Corinto in Nicaragua, the US just said, well, tough bananas, make us, and blew it off. And so that set a very bad green light for other countries. But we are beginning to see that, for instance, when other countries are signers to the International Criminal Court, such as Afghanistan, and if charges are raised, it may be more possible to go after the bigs by virtue of some of what has been done on other people's lands, when the courts could move forward on some of this litigation. I think that it certainly will remain very difficult to enforce, but I would not give up on the court of public opinion. And that often involves those simple steps that it's kind of easy to sidestep, writing that letter to the editor, writing that op-ed piece, going to your local faith-based community and saying, look, how about we do something to focus on peace on earth in a specific way, giving a voice to the people who are seeking refuge, who fled from the wars, and trying to really highlight their voices as much as we possibly can, insisting to university chancellors, for the university students, that you want your hard-earned tuition money to pay for coursework that's really going to benefit you in fighting climate catastrophe and militarism. So I think that we catch courage from one another. We need to, as much as possible, link with one another and actually also make it part of our social lives, our kinship, our way of enjoying ourselves in the world, to be involved in resistance.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Would Bruce or Kelsey, would you like to add to any of the first two questions? Oh, go for it, Kelsey. You're muted.
Hey there, sorry, my connection's a bit slow, I think. Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything Kathy just said. And it's a question that we don't get infrequently. Basically, what can I do that is going to change things? And I mean, that's the golden question, right? I mean, there's many things we could do. Is it going to change anything tomorrow? And unfortunately not. And this is why we have to think about challenging the arms trade, challenging militarism more broadly through a really systematic lens. These are systematic problems, and that's how we have to engage with them. So, I mean, everything that was listed, call your local paper, engage with your local representative, and that can even be on the local level. Local government really is the in terms of the power that you can inject in your political life. I always think the local government is where you can actually have most bang for your buck. So for go to City Hall and tell them that you want to be one of the municipalities that endorses the nuke ban treaty, right? I mean, you start a movement there, and that does have power in terms of applying pressure on national governments. But I also think it's important in the sense where it normalizes these conversations, right? So yeah, I mean, everything we've been saying, I think. On top of that, and I ask anyone in the chat too for ideas and how to engage with this. On top of that, Canada and military aid. So certainly not to the degree of the United States, but Canada does engage with what we would call military aid. So this is gifting, sometimes gifting, literally giving away, or selling, largely surplus goods to other governments. Bruce, you might be able to speak to this. Canada does do some of that. However, our data sources for it are not, we don't know if they're comprehensive. Canada doesn't view it as traditional arms transfers, so they don't report on it, again, as they have to. So we don't know the degree to which Canada fully engages in military aid. It should also be mentioned that a large portion of what we export to the United States in terms of arms is thereafter exported abroad through the infamous Foreign Military Sales Program, the FMS program, which I'm sure many of us are aware of. So where Canada might not be directly with many international locations, our Canadian goods are still being transferred, via military aid, likely through the FMS program.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. Go ahead, Bruce.
Well, I'd like to start with saying that Canada, I believe, spends about 0.9% of its GDP on military budget, and it's under the 2% that they're supposed to spend for their NATO membership. And in fact, they've been under very, very big pressure from England and the United States to up that spending. And in fact, then they use that as an excuse to the Canadian public as saying, look, they want us to spend more, but look how much like they try to play it off as like we are actually better by not spending this, extra 1.1% that on, and in fact I think we're in line with countries like Lithuania, and we're like 37th in line. But I did want to talk also the fact that the United States' new budget just put an additional $14 billion in its defense spending under the Biden's administration. And in that, you're seeing a country that spends about, was it 154 billion, and more than the next, I think 9 or 12 countries combined. And you're seeing in this, this spending, that 9 of those, I don't know, it's 12 countries and 9 of them are considered allies. But you're also seeing that the United States owes China $200 billion and is giving them in interest charges alone $28 billion in just interest charges. So that's about a fifth of China's defense budget. So the United States isn't just spending this money on itself, but it's also paying a fifth of China's budget for its military, which it seems to be gearing up for a Cold War with them as well, while paying for their arm to arm themselves. So I think we're seeing, a lot of these companies just doing whatever they want and with no consequences. I saw something the other day that Honeywell sold the F-35 blueprints to China. And it's just like, it's like, on one hand, you got politicians screaming and yelling viscerally in Canada and the United States about how awful China is. And then you have companies like Honeywell, which are, are selling these blueprints to these, very classified arms to China and receiving no sort of repercussions whatsoever. So the system is so rigged against us. It's laughable to actually think that and we're seeing in particular politicians like Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau who say one thing and then do the exact opposite, or with Trump, who just brazenly laughs in your face and does whatever he pleases. And we're seeing that more and more, that these politicians have no moral low ground. There's nothing, there's no more resignations. There's no more. It just seems that the morality of the political class is completely gone. So I hate to leave it with such our last question with such doom and gloom, but I think it's important to have the realities of the situation at hand to be presented. And I'll anything that we can do, like I said, the supposed progressive parties here in Canada aren't on board. So I don't know how to kind of like interject, like they other than making a new party here in Canada. But I don't know. Like I said, this is a big struggle, and it's not going to be like Kelsey said, it's not going to be fixed overnight, but we definitely have our work cut for us.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in closing, I'm going to actually read some of the comments in the chat that people have highlighted as other resources in order for all of us to get involved. And also really to highlight just another kind of action that has taken place. Again, as Bruce was saying, there isn't, political parties in Canada that really have taken this issue head on. But recently at the NDP convention, we passed a resolution called the Palestine Resolution to ban the arms trades specifically to Israel, as well as an arms embargo against Israel and a ban of the import of illegal settlement products. So if people wanted to get involved with that effort, I'm going to post the Palestine Resolution link in the chat here. And then also kind of to close, read some of the other things that people have flagged as actions to get involved. We have a request from Tamara for Americans on the call to get in touch with them to support Canada Live efforts to stop buying F-35s, so you can connect with Tamra. We also have Furkan, who's highlighting efforts in Langley and White Rock to pass resolutions in support of ICANN City's appeal. And also, just a general appeal to everyone to take part in some of the learning classes against militarism and highlighting connections to militarism and the environment, as well as becoming a global world citizen and looking at documentaries published by The World Is My Country. So all of that is, again, resources that's been published in the chat. And I want to take this time to thank all of our amazing panelists on this panel today, and also everyone across Turtle Island and around the world who has tuned into this session and who has come together for concrete action. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you for the next panel.
Thank you so much, and Genevieve, and to all the speakers, such an informative and engaging panel, and to the outstanding questions and discussion. We have exactly or just over 20 minutes until the next panel will begin. It'll be back here on this main stage. In the meanwhile, in line with this discussion, I would invite everyone who has not yet recorded a solidarity video to please go to the Take Action booth and do so. We've gotten some wonderful ones, but we don't yet have enough to be able to pull together the compilation video that we've promised and that we would love to share, especially with allies in Yemen, in Colombia, and in Palestine, highlighting that we need to shut down these arms fairs. We need to shut down the global arms trade in solidarity with everyone who is being attacked by these weapons, who's on the brunt end of these arms deals. So Greta will drop the link in the chat. Thank you, Greta. And I would encourage everyone to take advantage of these 20 minutes if you can, take a break, and also to record a very short solidarity video to be shared with our friends around the world, as well as in the countries that are selling these arms as an advocacy tool. It's also a great time to visit the expo booths and click on the networking tab. All of these things are in the left side of your screen to get a chance to chat with other conference attendees. Again, thank you so much, and we'll be back here on the stage at 4:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or in 20 minutes, wherever you are. Thanks again so much, and we'll see you soon.